Britain had a problem. Their entire aristocracy was addicted to Chinese tea, draining the empire's silver reserves to pay for it. China refused to buy British goods, creating a massive trade deficit that threatened Britain's economy. So Britain came up with a solution that would make modern drug cartels look ethical. Get millions of Chinese people addicted to opium, grown in British-controlled India, creating a drug epidemic so severe that China would be forced to trade silver for poison. When China tried to stop this genocide by addiction, Britain responded with warships and marines, fighting 2 wars to preserve their right to drug an entire nation. They won both wars, seized Hong Kong, carved up Chinese territory, and destroyed China's status as a sovereign power. All because British aristocrats couldn't give up their afternoon tea and the government wouldn't accept a trade deficit. This is the story of the Opium Wars, the most cynical and destructive narco-trafficking operation in history, run not by criminals but by the British Empire. This is about how tea addiction in London created heroin addiction in China, how an empire turned drug dealing into foreign policy, and how the moral justifications for imperialism collapsed when confronted with the simple fact Britain fought wars to protect drug dealers. To understand the Opium Wars, you need to understand just how obsessed Britain was with Chinese tea. By the late 18th century, tea had transformed from an exotic luxury into an absolute necessity for British society. Everyone drank tea, aristocrats in their parlors, workers in factories, soldiers in barracks. Tea breaks were built into the workday. The British Navy ran on tea. The expansion of the British Empire was fueled by tea. Britain had become a nation of tea addicts, and there was only one source: China. China in the 1700s was the world's largest and most sophisticated economy, producing luxury goods that Europeans desperately wanted: tea, silk, porcelain, and exotic spices. The Qing dynasty, which ruled China, controlled a vast empire with a population of over 300 million people, more than all of Europe combined. China was wealthy, powerful, and completely uninterested in anything Europeans had to offer. This created a massive problem for Britain. British merchants would arrive in Canton, modern Guangzhou, the only Chinese port open to foreign trade, with ships full of British-manufactured goods, textiles, tools, machinery. The Chinese merchants would look at these offerings and essentially say, "Why would we want any of this? We make everything we need ourselves, and we make it better than you do." The Chinese had no interest in British wool when they had silk. They didn't need British ceramics when they produced the world's finest porcelain. They didn't want British manufactured goods when Chinese craftsmen produced superior products. So trade was completely one-sided. British ships sailed to China loaded with silver to buy tea, silk, and porcelain. They sailed back to Britain with valuable Chinese goods. But the Chinese ships didn't sail to Britain buying British products. Silver flowed out of Britain into China in massive quantities. By the early 1800s, Britain was facing a serious economic crisis as its silver reserves drained away to feed the national tea addiction. The British government and merchants desperately sought something, anything, that Chinese consumers would buy. They tried various products: British textiles, metal goods, scientific instruments. The Chinese remained uninterested. Then the British found something that worked: opium. Opium is derived from poppies and had been used medicinally in China for centuries, primarily to treat pain and dysentery. But the opium traditionally used in China was relatively weak and consumption was limited. The British East India Company, which controlled vast territories in India, had access to something much more potent: Indian opium, specifically Bengal opium, which was stronger and more addictive than the varieties previously available in China. In the late 18th century, British merchants began selling Indian opium to Chinese consumers. The demand was initially small, but it grew rapidly. Opium was smoked in pipes, producing intense euphoria followed by addiction. Unlike tea or silk, which were luxuries people could do without, opium was a drug that created its own demand. Once someone became addicted, They needed more opium regardless of the cost. British merchants recognized this and understood they had finally found a product Chinese consumers would buy in enormous quantities, their own addiction. This was the solution to Britain's trade deficit. Instead of paying silver for tea, Britain would get the silver back by selling opium. The scheme was brilliantly cynical, used drug addiction to balance trade. The British East India Company held a monopoly on opium production in Bengal. They organized massive opium cultivation, processing the raw opium into standardized forms suitable for smoking and shipping it to China. Private British merchants, called country traders, would buy the opium from the East India Company and smuggle it into China, selling it for silver. That silver would then flow back to British merchants buying tea, completing the cycle. By the 1820s, the opium trade had become enormous. Thousands of chests of opium, each containing about 140 pounds of the drug, were being imported into China annually. Chinese addiction rates skyrocketed. What had been a minor social problem became a national crisis. Millions of Chinese people, from peasants to aristocrats, became addicted to opium. The drug destroyed families, ruined livelihoods, and drained Chinese silver reserves as the trade balance reversed. The Qing dynasty government watched with growing alarm as opium addiction spread throughout China. By the 1830s, the social and economic damage was catastrophic. It's estimated that by 1835, roughly 12 million Chinese people were addicted to opium, about 4% of the entire population. In coastal regions where opium arrived first, addiction rates were much higher, sometimes affecting more than 20% of adult males. The effects on Chinese society were devastating. Addicts would spend entire family savings on opium, leaving their families destitute. Agricultural productivity declined as farmers spent their time in opium dens rather than working their fields. The military was affected, with soldiers and officers becoming addicts, undermining China's defensive capabilities. Government corruption increased as officials took bribes to allow opium smuggling. The entire social fabric of China was being destroyed by a drug epidemic deliberately created by British merchants. The economic impact was equally severe. The flow of silver had reversed. For centuries, silver had flowed into China as Europeans bought Chinese goods. Now silver was flowing out of China to pay for opium, creating monetary crisis and inflation. The Chinese government, which collected taxes in silver, found its revenues declining. The economy was being drained to feed an addiction epidemic created by foreigners. The Qing government attempted to stop the opium trade through laws and enforcement. Opium had actually been illegal in China since 1729, but enforcement was weak and corruption was rampant. In the 1830s, the government decided to take drastic action. In 1839, the Daoguang Emperor appointed Lin Zexu, a respected official known for his integrity and competence, as imperial commissioner with orders to end the opium trade once and for all. Lin Zexu arrived in Canton in March 1839 and immediately took aggressive action. He demanded that foreign merchants surrender all opium in their possession and sign agreements promising never to smuggle opium again, with the penalty for breaking this agreement being death. He surrounded the foreign trading warehouses with troops and cut off food supplies, essentially besieging the foreign merchants until they complied. The British merchants initially refused, but Lin was implacable. He held them under siege for 6 weeks. Finally, Charles Elliot, the British Superintendent of Trade, ordered the merchants to surrender their opium, promising that the British government would compensate them for their losses. Over 20,000 chests of opium, worth millions of pounds, were handed over to Chinese authorities. Lin Zexu then staged one of history's most dramatic acts of drug destruction. Over a period of 3 weeks in June 1839, Chinese workers mixed the opium with salt and lime and dumped it into the sea at Human. The mixture dissolved the opium, rendering it useless. Lin documented the entire process carefully and sent reports to the emperor describing how he had cleansed China of the foreign poison. Lin also wrote an extraordinary letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to her moral sense. He pointed out that opium was illegal in Britain because it was recognized as harmful, yet British merchants were selling it to China. He asked, "Suppose there were people from another country who carried opium for sale to England and seduced your people into buying and smoking it. Certainly, your honorable ruler would deeply hate it and be bitterly aroused." The letter demonstrated that China understood exactly what Britain was doing and regarded it as a profound moral crime. But Lin badly misunderstood the British government's priorities. He assumed that Britain, a supposedly civilized Christian nation, would be embarrassed by the drug trade and would agree to stop it. He was wrong. The British government didn't care about the morality of drug trafficking. They cared about trade, about the silver that opium generated, and about British merchants' profits. Lin had just destroyed £2 million worth of British opium, and had done so, from the British perspective, without compensation or due process. In Britain, news of the opium destruction created outrage, not at the drug trade, but at China's actions against British merchants. The merchants who had lost their opium lobbied Parliament aggressively for military action. They framed the issue not as China stopping drug trafficking, but as China violating British property rights and free trade. They demanded that the British government send warships to force China to pay compensation and open more ports to trade. The British Parliament debated whether to go to war over opium in one of the most shameful sessions in its history. Some members, particularly William Gladstone, argued passionately against the war. Gladstone stated, "A war more unjust in its origin, a war more calculated in its progress to cover this country with permanent disgrace, I do not know, and I have not read of." He pointed out that Britain was about to fight a war to force China to accept drug imports, and that this was morally indefensible. But Gladstone's arguments lost. In 1840, Parliament voted to authorize military action against China by a narrow margin. The justification was dressed up in language about free trade, property rights, and diplomatic insults. But everyone understood the reality. Britain was going to war to protect drug dealers. The British assembled a military expedition, warships, marines, and Indian troops. This force arrived off the Chinese coast in 1840, and China quickly learned a devastating lesson about the technological gap between Chinese and British military forces. The Chinese military was enormous, with millions of soldiers, but it was equipped with outdated weapons and tactics. They had matchlock muskets, swords, and bows. The British had modern rifles, artillery, and most importantly, steam-powered warships. British warships could sail against wind and tide, positioning themselves wherever they wanted, bombarding Chinese coastal forts from distances where Chinese guns couldn't reach them. British infantry with rifles could slaughter Chinese soldiers armed with muskets and swords. The war was a massacre. The Chinese tried bravely to resist, but they were fighting with 16th century technology against a 19th century military. The British strategy was to blockade China's coast and rivers, strangling Chinese trade and threatening major cities. They captured strategic points along the coast, bombarded Chinese defenses, and pushed up the Yangtze River toward Nanjing. The Chinese government, facing the possibility of losing Nanjing and seeing the capital Beijing threatened, sued for peace. In August 1842, China and Britain signed the Treaty of Nanjing, the first of what Chinese call the unequal treaties. The terms were humiliating for China. China agreed to pay Britain £21 million in compensation, £6 million for the destroyed opium, £3 million for debts owed to British merchants, and £12 million for the cost of the war. China ceded Hong Kong Island to Britain permanently. China opened 5 ports to British trade, not just Canton. British citizens in China would be subject to British law, not Chinese law, creating extraterritorial rights. And critically, the treaty set a low fixed tariff on British imports, preventing China from using tariffs to protect its economy. Notably, the Treaty of Nanjing didn't actually mention opium. Britain was embarrassed enough by the war's origins that they didn't explicitly legalize opium in the treaty. But the practical effect was the same. With 5 ports open and British merchants subject only to British law, enforcing opium prohibition became impossible. Opium imports increased dramatically after the treaty. The Treaty of Nanjing shattered China's self-image as the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization surrounded by barbarians. For centuries, China had viewed itself as culturally and technologically superior to all other nations. Now, they had been defeated by people they considered barbarians and forced to sign a humiliating treaty on British terms. The psychological impact was profound. But the treaty didn't solve the underlying tensions. Opium imports increased after 1842, making the addiction crisis even worse. The Chinese government and people remained deeply opposed to the opium trade, while British merchants wanted even more access to Chinese markets. The treaty also created new points of conflict through its vague language and the extraterritoriality provisions that essentially made British citizens immune to Chinese law. Various incidents in the 1850s increased tensions. British and Chinese authorities clashed over the rights of Chinese officials to board British ships, over the treatment of Chinese citizens who had worked for British merchants, and over access to the walled city of Canton. These conflicts were aggravated by British arrogance and Chinese resentment. The spark for the Second Opium War came in October 1856 with the Arrow incident. The Arrow was a Chinese-owned ship that had been registered in Hong Kong and flew the British flag. Chinese officials boarded the ship in Canton, arrested the Chinese crew on suspicion of piracy, and allegedly lowered the British flag. The British consul claimed this was an insult to the British flag and demanded apologies and compensation. When China refused, Britain decided to use this incident as justification for another war. Britain was soon joined by France, which had its own grievances against China, primarily involving the execution of a French missionary. The British and French formed an alliance and launched the Second Opium War, also known as the Arrow War, in 1856. This war was even more destructive than the first. British and French forces attacked Canton, captured it, and then pushed north toward Beijing. The Chinese military, despite some attempts at modernization since the First Opium War, was still hopelessly outmatched. The Qing government was also dealing with the massive Taiping Rebellion, a civil war that would eventually kill over 20 million people, leaving few resources to fight the British and French. In 1860, British and French forces marched on Beijing. The Chinese emperor fled the capital. In one of the most notorious acts of cultural destruction in history, British and French troops looted and burned the Old Summer Palace, Yuanmingyuan, a vast imperial garden and palace complex that housed irreplaceable cultural treasures. The destruction was deliberate punishment for China's resistance and torture of British and French prisoners. With foreign armies occupying the capital, China had no choice but to accept British and French terms. The resulting treaties were even more humiliating than the Treaty of Nanjing. The Convention of Beijing in 1860 included multiple devastating provisions. First, and most cynically, opium was explicitly legalized. Britain forced China to legalize the import and sale of opium, ending any pretense that this wasn't about the drug trade. Second, more ports were opened to foreign trade, allowing deeper penetration into China's interior. Third, foreign diplomats would be allowed to reside in Beijing, which Chinese officials found deeply offensive. Fourth, China ceded more territory, the Kowloon Peninsula to Britain and territory in Manchuria to Russia, which had supported Britain and France. Fifth, additional reparations were imposed, further draining China's finances. Sixth, Christians would be allowed to proselytize freely in China, undermining traditional Chinese religion and society. With opium fully legalized in 1860, the drug trade exploded. British merchants, now operating legally, imported opium in quantities that dwarfed earlier smuggling. By the 1880s, opium imports to China exceeded 6,500 tons annually. But even this massive figure understates the scope of addiction, because China also began growing its own opium poppies domestically, particularly in Yunnan and Sichuan provinces. The Chinese government, having failed to stop opium imports through prohibition, eventually decided that if they couldn't stop opium, they might as well tax it and try to compete with British imports. This led to the bizarre situation where the Chinese government was encouraging domestic opium production to reduce dependence on British imports. By the early 20th century, China was producing far more opium domestically than it was importing, but this didn't reduce the addiction crisis. It made it worse. By the 1890s, it's estimated that roughly 40 million Chinese people, about 10% of the population, were opium addicts. In some regions, the addiction rate exceeded 25% of the adult population. Entire villages were populated by addicts. Opium dens lined the streets of Chinese cities. The drug had become so normalized that addiction carried relatively little social stigma in many communities. The effects on Chinese society were catastrophic. Millions of people lived in a drug-induced haze, unable to work productively or care for their families. Agricultural productivity in some regions collapsed as farmers chose opium cultivation over food crops. The military continued to be degraded by addiction among soldiers and officers. Government effectiveness declined as officials became addicts or corrupted by opium money. The economic drain continued as massive amounts of money that could have been invested in modernization instead went to opium. Meanwhile, Britain and other Western powers continued carving up Chinese territory and extracting concessions. The Opium Wars had demonstrated China's military weakness, emboldening other imperial powers. Russia, Japan, Germany, and France all seized Chinese territory or forced unequal treaties on China. By 1900, China had been reduced from the region's dominant power to a semi-colonial state carved into spheres of influence by foreign powers. The humiliation of the Opium Wars and the subsequent century of humiliation profoundly shaped Chinese national identity. The experience of being drugged, invaded, and carved up by foreign powers created a determination in China to never again be so weak, so vulnerable, so humiliated. This drive would eventually fuel Chinese nationalism, revolution, and ultimately the rise of modern China. As the 19th century ended, attitudes toward opium began shifting, even in the West. The anti-opium movement gained strength, driven by missionaries working in China who witnessed the devastation firsthand, by Chinese intellectuals and reformers who argued passionately against the trade, and eventually by changing Western attitudes toward drug addiction itself. In Britain, public opinion gradually turned against the opium trade as more information became available about its effects. The Royal Commission on Opium, established in 1893, was supposed to investigate the opium trade, but was stacked with pro-trade members. However, even this biased commission couldn't completely whitewash the damage. The evidence of addiction and social devastation was overwhelming. By the early 20th century, even the British government recognized that the opium trade had become morally indefensible. International pressure was mounting, particularly from the United States, which was dealing with its own opium problems. In 1906, China launched an aggressive anti-opium campaign, with the Qing government committing to eliminate opium production and addiction within 10 years. Britain, facing international criticism and wanting to improve relations with China, finally agreed to phase out opium exports. In 1907, Britain and China signed an agreement to reduce opium imports gradually over 10 years. The trade officially ended in 1917, though illegal trafficking continued for decades. But the damage had been done. Nearly a century of systematic drug trafficking had created generations of addicts, drained China's economy, corrupted Chinese institutions, and contributed significantly to China's collapse as a regional power. The Qing dynasty fell in 1911, replaced by a republic that quickly descended into warlordism. China descended into decades of civil war, Japanese invasion, and revolutionary upheaval. The opium plague was one significant factor in this catastrophe. The Opium Wars represent one of the darkest chapters in British imperial history and one of the most cynical uses of state power to support drug trafficking. Britain fought 2 wars, killed thousands of people, and helped create a drug epidemic that destroyed millions of lives, all because British aristocrats wouldn't give up their afternoon tea, and the British government wouldn't accept a trade deficit. The moral clarity of the situation is striking. China was the victim. Chinese officials were trying to protect their population from a drug epidemic deliberately created by foreign merchants. Commissioner Lin Zexu's destruction of opium was a legitimate public health action, not an attack on Britain. China's attempts to prohibit opium were entirely justified, yet Britain responded with overwhelming military force, imposing treaties that forced China to legalize the poison destroying its population. British justifications for the Opium Wars have aged particularly poorly. At the time, British officials and merchants claimed they were fighting for free trade, for British property rights, for diplomatic respect. These arguments were always thin disguises for the reality. Britain was protecting drug dealers. Modern historians and the British government itself acknowledge that the Opium Wars were morally indefensible. Wars of imperial aggression fought to preserve a drug trade that caused immense human suffering. The economic motivation is equally damning. Britain fought the Opium Wars not out of strategic necessity, but to preserve profits and balance trade. The British economy would not have collapsed without opium exports to China. Britain could have developed other export products, accepted the trade deficit, or found alternative sources of tea. Instead, Britain chose the path of deliberately addicting millions of people to solve an economic problem. The Opium Wars also exposed the hypocrisy of Victorian-era British moral rhetoric. Britain presented itself as bringing civilization, progress, and Christianity to the world. Yet Britain's actual behavior in China demonstrated that British imperialism was about profit and power, not moral uplift. You cannot claim to be civilizing people while deliberately addicting them to drugs.